Afternoon, everyone. I'm Joseph Sassoon, a professor at the School of Foreign Service and the History Department at Georgetown University. I have the great pleasure to introduce Dr. Dania Thafer, who's a political scientist with a focus on the political economy and international relations. And her current research explores the effect of state-business relations on economic development for the existing youth in rentier economies, with emphasis on the Arab Gulf states. Dr. Thafer recently obtained her PhD from the American University of Washington. Dr. Thafer will talk for 30 minutes, and then we will open it to Q&A. Please send all your questions via the chat. Without any further ado, Dr. Dania Thafer, thank you for joining us.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Sassoon, for the invitation, and thank you to the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies for having me. I hope that my discussion today, that everyone will find it intellectually stimulating and thought-provoking. I will answer questions at the end, given the nature of this platform that we're using. So just, you can go ahead and pose them as we go along if you like. I'm not going to look at them until after I finish speaking, but if you want to write them as you come up with them, that's fine as well. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'll go ahead and start now. So basically in my research, I mean, this is a very large research project, but I'm going to try to focus on current events and relating it to my research area. And then if you have any more detailed questions, please feel free to ask me. I'm going to try not to be so technical. I have some quantitative research, but I'll try to keep it very low on going into the technicalities of it, but just feel free to ask me questions afterwards. So most accounts of economic reform in the Arab Gulf states are usually centered on diversification, focused on the backdrop of the looming critical juncture where oil will become obsolete or run out. The rentier Arab Gulf states have reached a more eminent critical demographic juncture, management of which will determine their economic and political stability for decades to come. The youth are the largest sector of society and will be entering the workforce eminently. Working age population growth in Gulf rentier economies are increasing at high rates, and the opportunity for attaining the demographic dividend is on the horizon. And I would like to briefly shift your attention to this graph. I'm sorry, this is my first time using this app, so bear with me. You will notice, although there's slight variation in the distribution of age structures, one salient trend is clear, that the GCC states all consist of youth bulges transitioning into the working age population. After the Arab Spring shook governments throughout the Middle East, youth activism increased, and it manifested itself in different events, such as Kuwait's National Dignity Movement of November of 2012, Bahrain's Day of Rage protest in February of 2011, and Oman, for example, there was many, but Oman's Sohar protest in February of 2011. This increased youth frustration has largely been due to obstacles to economic empowerment and reform. They're also a sign of the growing dissatisfaction towards the deteriorating welfare state. And there are three prime reasons why policymakers should be deeply concerned. First, the possibility of attaining the demographic dividend, the critical juncture where the existing large youth cohort enter the workforce is the most opportune in the Gulf's economic history to have their highest productivity levels with regards to human capital. And this is for decades to come. Second, conversely, if this opportunity is missed, then with the current declining fertility rates, which I will bring you a chart here on declining fertility rates, you'll see that they've declined greatly since the 1980s. So when this current youth majority cohort reaches the retirement age, there will be an inversion of the population pyramids. And that will cause a high dependency ratio. This means that the next generation will have to support the large retired cohort, and this will cause economic stability for sure, especially if this happens in the case where everyone is concerned about how long will oil remain relevant or will oil reserves remain available. Anyways, and then the third concern is unemployment. And that's a more imminent concern for the short term. If the youth are not properly employed in these economies, in some states, there will be a high potential of economic and political stability. And that's a great concern for Saudi Arabia. And as witnessed in the Arab Spring, there is a positive correlation between youth bulges, unemployment, and political instability. Therefore, demographics should unquestionably play an integral role in the Arab Gulf states' economic development strategy. The Gulf states have invariably responded to the youth-led Arab Spring movements with little desire to substantively change political structures, and have instead focused their energies on innovation-led reform. And they have, in conjunction with the establishment of ministries of various youth-targeted programs, GCC states also have attempted to intimately link their 2030 visions, or 2035 in the case of Kuwait, to youth-focused innovation-led development strategies. And for example, you see that Tamkeen in Bahrain is one institution that focuses on that. In Kuwait, you see the Kuwait National Fund for Small and Medium Enterprise Development, or for example, in Qatar, the Qatari Development Bank. All of these are targeting nascent private sector development. So my question is, I want to look at a problem that I think has not been addressed adequately. I want to look at how the institutional environment of state business relations affect the necessary economic reform that fosters innovation needed for rentier economies to convert their youth bulges into demographic dividends. So what drove me to conduct this research? Well, when looking at Gulf economies, formal and informal institutional design, it systematically discriminates against youth who are joining the workforce or opening new businesses, stripping them of their agency to contribute to innovation, and kind of perpetrates the top echelons of the business elite. And the problem with this is business elites in the Gulf tend to focus heavily on large white elephant projects, such as malls, complexes, hotels, and they can be valuable to economic development. However, there's a high disproportionate focus on such projects, and these projects crowd out opportunities for entrepreneurship and innovation. And, you know, I mean, today, if you look at the situation of the Gulf economies, you're going to see that they're suffering greatly because, one, there's an unfortunate price war over the oil markets, but also the fact that diversification hasn't taken advantage of the digital industrial revolution enough, in my opinion. And so what happened is that their economies emphasize heavily on tourism, on all of these issues that are related to disposable income. And right now, when we're at a phase of necessity and we need, let's say, the internet and let's say Zoom and everything else that facilitates business today, I think the Gulf economies will lose. So innovation is incredibly important for their economic well-being. And looking at the role of the business elite is one of my primary focus on economic development in the Gulf states. And the reason being is that the business elite controls 75% of the private sector, and their wealth, as of a few years ago, accounted for $3 trillion. They employ 70% of the private sector labor force and mostly hire expats or migrant workers in lieu of the national youth. And studies have shown that businesses owned by families, which business elite families in the Gulf are generally family-owned businesses, have the lowest level of research and development. And to add to that, I think some of the patriarchal or patrimonial corporate cultures that break the causation between work and reward really affect innovation in the Gulf economies. And just to talk very briefly about the methodology for this research, I did a longitudinal statistical analysis on a global scale for 129 countries, looking at how oil wealth along with institutional quality affects the output of innovation. Also, I did a good amount of qualitative analysis, which consists of historical institutionalism, comparative case studies of Qatar, Kuwait, and Bahrain, and a series of expert interviews. And I have three primary arguments. First, that rentier economies, institutional characteristics, and market dominance by business elite can stifle innovation, which consequently undermines the prospect of achieving the demographic dividend. Let me change the picture here. Second, by applying historical institutional approach, this study explains how rentier economies originated from particular social political antecedents and were influenced by various power brokers in the pre-oil era, impacting institutional structures that undergird the politics of reform. And this caused differing levels of business elite dominance in the Gulf economies, and therefore caused variance in the level of state-led capitalism across the three states that I studied, Kuwait, Qatar, and Bahrain. And the third argument is that in the current context, the institutional arrangement of rentier states, in this context, the state with the highest levels of centralized state-led capitalism and lowest levels of business elite dominance is more empowered to realize the demographic dividend from innovation-led development than the others. Now, existing currents of thinking on the literature of the resource curse, rentier economies, and the demographic dividend have failed to highlight the connection between political forces and economic policies that affect societies with youth bulges. And a central goal of this mixed methods research is to illuminate this gap and point to alternative strategies to make the most of this extraordinary opportunity that may only arise once for decades to come. The subject of resource wealth and institutional environments effect on the output of innovation is sparsely addressed, especially in two of the three literatures I named, the rentier state literature and the resource curse literature. And all these literatures have neglected innovation as a variable as a whole. And I take a very Schumpeterian assumption with regards to economic development, if you haven't noticed, that innovation-led development is necessary for rentier economies seeking to have dynamic private sectors in order to attain the demographic dividend. Now, let me situate the particularities of the Gulf region in a broader global context with the aim of gaining a more generalizable understanding of rentier economies and how institutional quality and market dominance affects state innovation levels. So overall, when you conduct a statistical analysis, you look at resource wealth, how it affects innovation. There's a negative relationship. So it suggests that resource wealth has a negative effect on innovation levels. I'm going to pull up this slide here. And this slide shows an interaction effect. So basically how institutional quality and oil wealth or rentier wealth affect innovation. One of the prime findings is that if you look at the bottom line here, and this is a predictive margins on resource wealth per capita on innovation by institutional level, which I just kind of said it in a less technical way. So rentier economies with low institutional performance compounds negative effects of innovation. So you see that line here at the bottom. As rentier wealth increases, going to the right, you will see at low quality institutions that compounds the negative effect on innovation. Now, when you look at the top, however, which shows that there is some opportunity for rentier states to be able, it's an indicator or suggests that there is an opportunity for rentier states to be able to achieve innovation, but they have to have high quality institutions in this case. So with high quality institutions, there is an opportunity to achieve innovation. As you see at the top green line, that there's a positive relationship there. Okay. So let me talk about linking innovation quality and what I found in rentier economies, that rentier states that have higher state-led capitalism tended to have higher levels of institutional quality. So when you evaluate the GCC states, you will see that there's a binary relationship. Either you have high state-led capitalism or like higher business elite dominance. And neither are mutually exclusive, yet their levels of influence vary in the two different economies. Now, before I delve into more details, I think everyone's wondering, okay, what is state-led capitalism? And there are two factors that are important for state-led capitalism. First is that the state embraces it as a strategic long-term policy choice, and that state capitalists primarily view markets as mechanism that serves national interests rather than serving like societal interests. And there are certain tools that are used in state-led capitalism. That includes sovereign wealth funds. You'll see these in the rentier economies of the Gulf states. They're very important tools. Sovereign wealth funds, state-owned enterprises, national oil companies. All of these are important tools. So the presence of these institutions do not necessitate, state-led capitalism, but serve as an indicator, and you will notice them prevalent in the Gulf states. Okay, now the way I look at business elite dominance, I look at the number of elites and their influence in primary sectors of the economy, and for this study, their ability to act as veto players in the reform process. Okay, so looking at general trends, in my quantitative analysis, what I found was that high market dominance is inversely and strongly inversely related to innovation, meaning that it has a strong negative effect on innovation. And that actually was found true in my case studies as well. I looked at, now that since I'm looking at the demographic dividend, I evaluated case studies of the Asian economies that were successful in achieving the demographic dividend. And I wanted to see what components of those economies can be a possible contributor for rentier economies to achieve the demographic dividend. And what I noticed is when I evaluated state business relations for economic reform and in a highly centralized top-down reform context, such as Japan, I found that that was a driver in innovation-led development for Japan. And I also looked at South Korea, which has more business elite dominance, and how the state led innovation and created the incentives for these actors within the economies, whether it's research institutions, business elites, and whatnot, and defined them and created incentives for them and followed through on those incentives. And I think because the Gulf economies, by nature, an endemic characteristic of them is that they're very centralized. Because, you know, if you look at how oil is developed, I mean, you have a few amount of people involved in the process of extracting the oil and selling it and producing it. And so the money goes to the state and then trickles down to the rest of the economy. It's very centralized economy by nature. So I thought that using these aspects of innovation-led development of the Asian economies and applying them to the Gulf states would be useful. And another interesting point that I would like to say is that Qatar, which is one of the more centralized Gulf economies, rentier economies, it had higher levels of innovation relative to its peer states, whereas Kuwait, one that had lower levels of innovation, was much more decentralized and had business elite actors very active in the economy. And you can actually notice these results by looking at the entrepreneurship index and the global competitive index, specifically at the innovation and ecosystem markers, and you will actually find that relationship. So what caused these states to have varying levels of state-led capitalism or business elite dominance? I'm going to touch on this briefly. This is more historical, and I think that it's important to look at how institutions were formed and negotiated at state formation. And when you look at this historical context, merchant bargaining powers, and back in the day, business elites were referred to as merchants, and that was because they were mainly traders and active and these sort of industries related to business, and they were just called merchants. So merchant bargaining powers as a function of their economic diversification levels at the critical juncture where oil was discovered, created a path dependency for varying levels of state-led capitalism. So the more business elites that were able to negotiate, the more favorable terms they received and were able to have more dominance in the political economy following, which is the oil era, the post-oil era. And what you will notice is that Qatar had the least amount of diversification for its merchants, and Kuwait had the most. Bahrain was somewhere in the middle. And so basically, the Kuwaiti merchants had high bargaining power as a result of their high level of economic power. The Bahrainis had a moderate level, and Qataris had none. So there were no business elites at the table when oil wealth was discovered or even produced, because in Qatar, oil wealth wasn't produced adequately until 1949. So there was nobody at the table. In turn, you'll see that Kuwait will have a lot more business elite dominance in its current economy. You'll see Kuwait has a lot of state-led capitalism in its current economy. And another interesting point is the civic traditions that were sealed on that. So when you have a group that are able to negotiate with the state, you're going to have a more democratic outcome. And you can see that in Kuwait, and you can see that that relationship in Qatar. Now, I want to go ahead and move on to the more current situation. I just wanted you to get a good picture of how things developed. It was a very basic presentation of it, but if you have questions about the details, I'd be happy to answer them. Now, the more dominance that business elite have in the private sector in the current oil-rich economies, the more influence they have over state institutions to counter economic reform necessary to achieve the demographic dividend. And to prove my argument, I look at the three cases of Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, and I look at I evaluate the level of business elite influence over institutions and their ability to influence the economic reform process as a determinant of the level of business elite dominance versus state-led capitalism. So for Kuwait, reforms that were implemented were actually reversed by business elite pushing for their interests. And if you look at the breakdown of business elite influence on institutions such as the National Assembly in Kuwait, what you will see is even with the changes, the recent last few years changes in the electoral districts, anybody following Kuwait would know about this, the merchant family's influence did not witness significant change in their electoral reforms. Their district, which is the second ring area, by virtue of design remains a stronghold for them, with about 40,000 constituents, whereas most districts have 1,020. When evaluating the Parliament of Kuwait, there is a strong presence of business elite and leadership positions. For example, the Speaker of the Parliament, Marzouk Al-Ghanem, is from a business elite family. And moreover, over the history of Kuwait's parliament, 9 of the 11 speakers were from business elite families. Now, how are business elites able to reverse economic reforms that were against their interests? Well, you know, everybody that follows Kuwait knows that there's like oppositional forces, and there were points where there were oppositional parliaments that were elected. And these oppositional parliaments, they do challenge the government, but they also challenge the business elite. And at one point, they passed economic policies to regulate and increase transparency of the private sector. For example, the Build Operate Transfer Law, which was established in, which was passed in 2008. It was widely criticized by the business elite for creating barriers to conducting business. The law heavily regulated public-private sector cooperation, so meaning the government having contracts with the business elites and whatnot. And the business elites were very unhappy with this law. So it caused them to strategize and align further with the government. And this alignment effectively ended up weakening the opposition, which had a strong youth component. And in the wake of the 2013 election, business elites were effectively able to reverse economic policies, including the BOT law that I just discussed. So two divergent forces of Kuwait's society, the opposition versus a business elite, are pitted against each other in the National Assembly, yet share one commonality. The jolting against and for elite dominance undermines reforms beneficial to the economic prosperity of Kuwait and the youth entering the private sector. The business elite have aligned with the state against oppositional parliaments and have shown the ability to influence and reverse reforms. They also undermined labor reforms by first of all, not following any of them. And I can talk about that in detail afterwards. Now, in my second case, Bahrain, the reforms are significantly diluted. Bahrain's structure is a little bit different. The business elite have a certain level of dependency on the royal family. They're not too fond of the parliament. They do prefer the upper chamber, which is the Majlis Ashura, which has more business elite influence. At one point, I've seen 15%, and whereas the elected parliament only has like 2.5% of business elite. And this is roughly related to a lot of the divisions within Bahrain, which anyone that follows Bahrain would probably know them, but I can't talk about them at the moment because we have limited time. So the various centers of Bahraini politics are, you have the old guard, which you have the prime minister, the business elites and their lobbying bodies, and then you have the new guard, which you have the crown prince Salman bin Hamad bin Isa al Khalifa, along with his new generation of technocrats. Anyways, so in 2008, the crown prince, along with his technocrats, they wanted to implement some labor reforms, and the business elites were very unhappy with this reform. Basically, they contested it because the labor reform aimed to gradually phase out the inflexible nature of the Bahrainization policy. And the target was to curb of this policy was to curb against hiring migrant workers by instituting a fee-based system for hiring expats. However, they negotiated the business elite, and were able to cut the fees by 1/7, plus they were able to cut the visa renewal fees by 2/3. So the business elites of Bahrain were able to dilute reforms as they like. Now, the third case, which is Qatar, there's a kind of a blurred line between state business relations in Qatar. Qatar does not have a parliament like Kuwait and Bahrain. So there's a lot of informal institutions in which the business elites negotiate with the state. The state uses state-led capitalism to give the business elite some influence, but kind of regulates that. And different institutions in Qatar that are used is the Chamber of Commerce, the Majlis al-Shura. Majlis al-Shura has about 17% of business elite families within it. And state-owned enterprises are a big part of that. So business elites get a lot of influence by being on boards and being in leadership positions of SOEs, which is pretty much controlled by the government. Actually, I can show you, here is a graph. You will see all the red there is basically what the government owns in the top 10 companies in Qatar. So you see a lot of red here. The government has a lot of influence, a substantial amount of influence. When you compare it to Kuwait, here, look at the red in these top 10 companies. The government doesn't own as much or remotely as much as the Qatari government owns. Anyways, so now looking at Qatar today, anyone can see that Qatar had to apply swift reforms, and it did. Because the circle of business elites are so small and so much linked to the rulers that it is much easier. There's not this level of negotiation and debate with the overall society, overall business elite for reform. And you'll see that Qatar, out of these states, has the most progressive labor reforms. They removed the exit visa, and were able to implement economic reforms much quicker than the rest, even though I've interviewed many business elite that said they were very unhappy and lobbied heavily against these reforms, but they were implemented because the state is so closely linked to business that it sees the state survival trumps short-term business interest, whereas business elites see short-term interest or their interest trump, I think, state survival. I mean, it's not as much in their calculus as it would be for a state that has state-led capitalism. So concluding here, hold on. I know these pictures are flying around. The asymmetry of interest between youth majority and the business elite, in higher degree of business elite dominance in the private sector, has more obstacles for innovation-led development. And business elite interests are negligible in advancing these economies in a manner that would be productive for their majority youth population. The dominance of business elites constricts the economic development needed to harness youth talent. States and elites both, especially in contexts of high business elite dominance, compromise economic longevity. Business elites and the ruling families partnered their interests during the Arab Spring against oppositional forces. The amalgamation, of state-fearing political reforms and business elites fearing economic reforms together compromise economic longevity of the rentier state. And there is a push and pull in reform in more democratic rentier states, as we witnessed in Kuwait. And the business elites use democratic institutions such as the parliament to subvert reforms that regulate the private sector. And as a boomerang effect, in response, their dominance, the oppositional parliaments, that are often dissolved, institute regulations that thwart development as a means to barricade the privileged positions of the business elites. So the ultimate conclusion is rentier economies have a binary choice of high state-led capitalism or higher degrees of business elite dominance. Either way, I'm not so optimistic. Neither high state-led capitalism nor business elite dominance produced in rentier economies are positive variables for the level of innovation-led development conducive to attaining the demographic dividend. However, given that these are the only options ostensibly available in rentier economies, state-led capitalism has proven to be the most resistant to some of the adverse consequences of business elite dominance on economic reform. And I have this graph here that kind of showed everything that I brought up: level of merchant bargaining, how that affects the trajectories and creates a path dependency to the level of influence that business elites have on institutions, and affect how much state-led capitalism there is, and that in turn affects how many obstacles exist for reform, and the level of innovation and that can be achieved in those economies, and also the institutional quality of those economies. It was a lot to cover in a short amount of time.
Thank you very much, really, for a very, very excellent presentation and